Hey everyone, Mr. Weinland here with the last video for world history this academic season. Here, as I am very disappointed and sad, but it is what it is. This is the last of the videos for not only chapter 16, but the last chapter I'm going to cover. I will have to throw a little bit of a disclaimer here. We are going to be talking about slavery and its origins, how it began. So this is a tragic story. It's not a very positive one, but it is one that I need to feel like still needs to be talked about. It's world history. It's not just an American issue; it's a world issue, and it's something that needs to be talked about. Um, Now, and we're going to mostly talk about slave trade, not so much slavery itself, but we're going to get into slave trade. Now, obviously, slavery existed well before Age of Exploration and the colonies, but and it existed in many different parts of the world. However, it really did play a big part in the age of exploration, and we're going to talk a little bit more about those origins and how people were forced, basically, off of their lands and their lives just ruined because they were forced on a boat, shipped off somewhere, and just it really changed everything. We're talking farmers, merchants, priests, soldiers, musicians, fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, future kings, queens. Uh, you know, we're talking about really important key individuals that could have helped shape places like Africa to make them, pretty much the future of that country or those countries in Africa and that continent, and or not country of Africa, the continent of Africa, but many countries in the continent of Africa to make them have a future, a brighter future. And many of those great talents were taken and shipped off elsewhere. Your answer number 18, did slave labor decline in the Americas as a result of the age of exploration? The answer to that is no. Um, so we do see that the age of exploration did open up um, more chances for people to be shipped off overseas. Primarily, a lot of that is because the natives were already put into slavery. The native people within, North America, South America, Central America, they were already put into slavery, but because of disease, because of violence, many of their populations were dying. And remember, we talked a little bit about this in section 2, I believe, but the idea was we have these big plantations like sugar, tobacco. These things need to be grown, and we need large labor, but we need cheap labor, and they didn't want to pay anybody. It's like, why pay them? So they went out and they needed slaves, and there was a market for that, sadly. And we see that this happens in a large scale. This becomes a big, huge problem, but it works for those who are ultimately a part of this mess. We see that, the big thing is number 28 right there. Planters in Americas began to use African slaves for labor because of what? It's right there because Native Americans and European, they first used Native Americans, but then European disease killed off millions of Native Americans. So there you go. European disease killed none of these Native workers. And so this meant that they had to venture out into the slavery market. And this was a big deal. We see that a lot of individuals came from, they were forced on boats taken from the coast of West Africa, which is your answer to number 25. So, where was most slave forts located? West coast of Africa. So, we see a lot of others were kidnapped on raids by traders, and we see these individuals were forced on a boat and then shipped off into the New World. This was known as the triangular trade, and I'll show you on the map here in a few minutes. But basically, what happened is the first leg of the triangle ships were carrying Europe goods to Africa, and then those goods would be used to purchase slaves. Then the second leg, which was the Middle Passage, which is your answer number 2, between 10% and 20% of all captive and Africans did not survive the what? The Middle Passage. That's your answer. I'm going to go ahead and give you number 22, the Middle Passage. And what you see is that these individuals were then sold, have been sold to the Americas, as they were sent across the Atlantic to cross the Atlantic uh, to those locations. Then the third leg was to carry American products to Europe, which then would be traded for money. So some slave traders from America sailed directly to Africa, not really heading back to Europe, but that's how the triangular trade network worked. And so, like I said, here's how it worked. Again, you would see that they would head down here into Africa. They would basically trade for slaves or purchase slaves, which then they would sell to the Americas. And you would see in different parts in North America, which would be British colonies, and then you would see Spanish colonies as well, and Portuguese and Dutch colonies in these areas. Now, we can see that a lot of this, and again, this is why I want to say this is not so much um, an American issue. It's not just the United States of America slavery. It's dealing with the world as well, because some of the first to get slaves were, the Portuguese in Brazil, some of the Spanish. And we do see that the British eventually, when they take claim of this land, they do take in more. They take in slaves as well. But you see, by the millions were sent to Brazil, and then only in North America, it's just under 500,000. But we see that this becomes a big issue, a big problem, because many individuals who lived in this part of Africa and this continent, part of the continent, lost their lives and were now sold into I guess you could call it a hell that nobody asked for. And so it's just really sad. But the triangular trade, like I said, you would take the goods down to Africa, pick up slaves, sell them here, and then you get your goods or money here, and then back to Europe, and they'd start the process again. So it's in the shape of a triangle. So this was the triangle trade. Very sad, very rough, a huge ordeal, very terrifying. Um, so we see that captive Africans were chained together, forced into the dark in cramped quarters. Couldn't sit nor stand. Journey sometimes lasted up to 3 to 6 weeks. About 10 to 20% did not survive the trip of the Middle Passage. So very rough, horrific. We see that many things were, just awful conditions. Aluda Iquano wrote he was a former slave, or who was on this ship. He said that the stench of the hold was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any time. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole scene of horror almost inconceivable. So just imagine, just it's hard to imagine, actually. It's just really hard to imagine, just awful conditions, how these individuals were treated. And it's bad. It's just sick. Slave traders carried captive Africans to the Americans. We see the Spanish were sending some to the Caribbean sugar plantations, which is your answer to number 27. The Spanish used captive Africans for what? Workers on a Caribbean sugar plantation. And then your answer, number 26, according to the map titled The Slave Trade, the greatest number of African slaves were taken to what? Brazil, which is your answer right here, number 26. So, like I said, the Portuguese and the Spanish have a big part in this. Have probably more of a big part in this, because they actually shipped or had shipped over more slaves than even the English. The English West Indies, but also to the colonies in North America. England dominated the slave trade by the end of the 1600s, but then you start to see that die off in the 1600s. We see that England, and this is what usually happens. A lot of European, a lot of European countries eventually started to not need slaves. We see that they finally paid a lot of the workers. The idea of slaves kind of also, they kind of were picking up like, this isn't right, this isn't good. So you start to see that eventually slave trade transitioned out of Europe, and eventually it did for England. Um, the colonies were established. Slaves were still in what was now the new United States of America. We see that, and it's interesting because there are actually, many different writings about this, about the founders, and there's also, a lot of videos and things out there. When the Constitution came to be, you know, slavery was a big issue. There was many who were a lot of the founders were starting to see that slavery was going to die off eventually. They saw the writing on the wall. They saw that eventually slave trading or some form of slavery in America was not going to be acceptable, and that it was dying out. But sadly, there were still many plantation owners that who were involved in the Continental Congress or involved with the Congress, and basically really pushed for slavery. And so it was kicked down the road, sadly. And it's sad that it took a big major war, a civil war, to finally force the South to do the right thing. And that's the sad thing here about it. And that especially the North had to do that as well. So, but it's interesting because the founders were basically starting to see the writing on the wall, and could have stopped slavery during the time of the new Constitution. But again, the plantations needed that free labor, that cheap labor, and that many of the southern states did not want to give that up. And sadly, that just put a burden on the United States. I mean, and there was probably some intertrading going on throughout the beginning of the United States of America up until the Civil War, but eventually you were starting to see that many were starting to look like slavery shouldn't be around. We do see that jobs, most slaves worked on the plantations, other worked in mines and towns in the countryside. There were some skilled craft workers like carpenters, metal workers, coopers, continued crafting. Women were mostly had domestic duties. The living conditions were not great. They had to meet their own basic needs at the end of the workday. Cooking, mending, tending the sick was up to the was around the work for the was fitted in around the work for the slaveholder. Living conditions were very harsh, physical, degrading punishment inflicted for minor offenses. So and also to be fair, they also depended on the plantation and the plantation owner. You would see many that did take advantage of their slaves, mistreated them poorly. Others not so much. It just kind of depended on the owner and how successful they were. Still, conditions weren't great, but they're probably better than some other plantations. Many slaveholders lived in constant fear, though, of a rebellion of angry slaves who could no longer take the harsh treatment and face on plantations. And honestly, that actually happened in the Civil War, when a lot of men had to go and fight in for the South in the Civil War. A lot of women were left behind in charge of the plantations, and there was a fear that because they didn't have the support to keep their slaves in order, they feared for their lives that they let their slaves go, and that was a bit of a thing. And honestly, didn't blame them, because honestly, you were basically locking people up, and they are probably every day of their lives are hoping and praying for a time where they could be set free, even if it means by force. And there have been stories where certain slaves had led an uprising, some not as successful as others. And the sad thing is that in the laws of the Americas, it considered enslaved Africans as property. They were not people according to the law. That's awful, but that was their law at the time. Slaves had no rights or freedoms. Slaveholders controlled most of the conditions under which they lived. So they played a big part in that. Often enslaved people endured brutal treatment, abuse, much abuse, and it was just awful. Slaves coped with inhumane conditions many different ways. Some resisted by trying to keep cultural traditions alive. This is your answer to number 24. So some enslaved Africans coped with inhumane conditions by trying to keep their what? A cultural traditions alive. And this is going to open up the door for certain cultures to kind of blend and come together in this time. And some of these traditions that we know of today, or may have come from Africa, have been able to stay here in America and in some form or fashion, because certain individuals have tried to incorporate their traditions from Africa to this the American culture. And then we see this is where religion plays a part, especially for black slaves in the time of America. We see that religion becomes a form of hope that a lot of these individuals, probably early on when they're in their belief, are praying for that the one day that, when this is all over, that they will be with Jesus, and that's why what all their beliefs. And some are praying and hoping that eventually slavery will end in their time, and be able to enjoy that freedom. But we see that religion played a big part in that, in their faith, their hope, and also just being able to also use that to come up with songs as well. That gospel music comes from that as well, from the faith and hope from Christianity. Some fought back. One ways was slowing the work, really kind of making it more difficult on the owners and the slaveholders. Destroying equipment, revolting. Probably more success with slowing the work, destroying equipment in ways that would frustrate the slaveholders. But revolting sometimes didn't always work, and a lot of times got a lot of individuals killed. Some were able to flee, some were able to find ways to get out. There was the Underground Railroad eventually, that Harriet Tubman was able to free a lot of individuals, thanks to also the U.S. military as well. We do see that the effects of slave trade, 400 years of the Atlantic slave trade, devastated a lot of societies. Like I said, estimates about 15 to 20 million Africans were shipped to the Americas against their will. So that's your answer to number 15, between 15 and 20 million people. That's a lot of people. And then they're having families and bringing new individuals into the world who eventually are going to be forced into slavery. And so millions upon millions upon millions. And it's heartbreaking. It's awful. And we see that also millions were sent to Europe, Asia, Middle East. It wasn't just the Americas, but sadly, that was a big problem. The human cost, enormous. We see countless died in the transit, millions deprived of their freedom. Many didn't even get to see that chance of freedom. Descendants doomed to lives of forced servitude, because even if you had a baby, it's like, I mean, it's an awful feeling. If you're a mother who, you just had a child and you're just so thankful for your child, and now knowing that it's not going, you, even though it's your baby, it's not going to be, you're not going to be treated like it's your baby. And that's the sad thing, is that they're forced into slavery. This affected Africa as well. We see that the slave raiders captured the strongest young future leaders. So you're basically taking all the strong individuals of that society and basically wrecking some of those cultures' futures. Dividing Africans from one another. There are certain individuals, certain tribes who were basically would sell out to protect their own people, which, I mean, it makes sense because you want to make sure you're not it. But some of them, unfortunately, that tactic didn't work. Forced labor of millions of Africans did not enrich Africa as well. So um, it was just devastating. Economies as well. Forced labor of Africans did not enrich other parts of the world. We see labor of African slaves build economies of many American colonies. Their knowledge of agriculture contributed to the growth of industry in southern English colonies. And then we see that this spread a culture. As a result, though, the slave trade, people of African descent spread throughout America as Western Europe. We do see a bit of a spread known as an African diaspora, where we do see a lot of their culture is spread throughout these areas of the world, where eventually they're spread of from African culture, from music to art, religion, food, spread throughout the Western world. And we see that even in certain parts of America, here in the United States, where you see in certain places in the states where certain cuisine and certain food types have been formed or created because of African cultures coming into the Americas. So, anyway, that is going to do it for chapter 16, the Age of Exploration. As we learned, the force of countries to go in and try to establish an empire, put pressure on other countries, go and create new economies, and then eventually trying to force cheap labor with slavery. So that has been talked about, and that is going to do it for world history. I'm done. We're done. So as soon as you're done with chapter 16 and you've done the worksheet or the Google form, you are done with the class. So how about that? Give yourself a round of applause. It's the class is over. So Again, sad that we couldn't go over this in class and talk a little about more about this material and more things. I had other things planned, but hopefully, you know, I'll have you in other classes. And for some of you who are graduating, farewell. Have a good one. You're going to do great. I'm sorry about 2020 not being so awesome, but I miss you. I miss all my students, but hopefully 2020 to 2021 will be a much brighter year. So I'll see you later. Bye.